Hello and welcome to Designing for Resilience with the B3 Guidelines. I'm Richard Graves. I'm the Director of the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota. And I'm joined by Liz Kuchke, a research fellow at the center, and also Becky Alexander, an architect and researcher at LHB. In addition, we'll have Dan Handine, another research fellow at the center, as our moderator during the question and answer period. So our learning objectives today are to understand the linkage between natural and man-made hazards and their impact on building, site, and community resilience, and to demonstrate how to conduct a vulnerability and capacity assessment during project planning, programming, and analysis. We'll also compare and contrast the resilience strategies from green building rating systems that can be incorporated into project planning, design, and development, and how to incorporate mitigation and adaptation strategies into project planning, design, and development to ensure sustainable operations despite future uncertainty. So what is resilience? And resilience is the capacity of a system, be it an individual, a forest, a city, or a building, to deal with change and to continue on with the operations of life. And as we've seen over the last few years, that these disruptions can take many forms, from hurricanes in Puerto Rico that disrupted and knocked the power out to this hospital that was restored by Tesla installing solar panels and solar batteries months before the electrical grid was back up and running, to disruptions like buildings being burned during the civil unrest of the past few months, where business owners need to figure out how to rebuild, restore operations. Homes were built and people need to find new homes, et cetera, et cetera. To the changes we're seeing by the global pandemic that's changing our work lives, having many of us work from home, changing the way we use offices, and many other things, to things like the fires that we see in the West that have burned whole towns, destroyed people's homes, et cetera, et cetera. These disruptions can take many forms, and we need to start to figure out how to incorporate them into the built environment. And we need to integrate them with our green building systems, not have a whole separate set of sort of resilience guidelines, because we need both resilience and sustainability to have the built environment that we need in the future. And so, a few kind of definitions to keep in mind. Resilience is this capacity to deal with change and to continue to develop. And they also, these changes or disruptions expose sort of vulnerabilities in our systems that we need to kind of think through, plan for, theorize with our project teams what kinds of disruptions might happen, so that we can design into our systems the ability to address these things. And the B3 guidelines, as many of you know, we've had hundreds of buildings go through the system, many different building types. So it's a good sort of proxy for the general built environment to think about what kinds of things should we incorporate. And for quite a few years now, we've had a lot of sort of requests by state agencies, the Department of Administration, Department of Commerce, and the Department of Commerce, who are our sponsors of the program, and also the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which is very interested in resilience, has sort of asked us to think about, how can we integrate resilience into the B3 guidelines. And so to do this, the approach that we took in some of our early research sponsored by MPCA, that was the kind of forerunner to the work that we've done, that we're now integrating into B3. It's very difficult to kind of think about, is it a hurricane? Is it a thunderstorm? Is it a tornado? Is it, there's hundreds and hundreds of potential event type things that could disrupt the built environment. The approach we took was to think of, to try to think of, based upon other work that we've done at the center, let's think of the built environment and how it can become a regenerative system versus our existing approach to kind of systems in the built environment. The existing approach thinks of, is really focused on efficiency, thinks of the sources of materials or energy, water, et cetera, as sort of one-way throughputs through the building. And instead, if we start to think of the built environment as a regenerative system, mimicking natural systems, we would think of, the built environment as sort of a circular system, that things are used, reused. We have multiple sources of supply of the things we need, energy and water, et cetera. Because we have multiple sources of supply and we're trying to generate energy or from the sun, or we're trying to do rainwater capture, things like that, we need to be able to store resources so that when we collect them, we can store them and then release them over time as the users of a building are using them. And so our hypothesis was that, if buildings are more like these living systems, having storage and other things, they would have a better ability to kind of deal with or adapt to disruptions that may occur from events. And so, what we did is we took, and we based some of this work based upon work that the federal government had done. The Department of Energy and Department of Defense had done a series of sort of assessments of disruptions at military bases, and they disrupted the bases from certain things, disconnecting them from power, disconnecting them from water, added different weather events that would occur, things like that. And they sort of gamed them out, made changes to the base, and then tested them again. And we took a very similar approach, taking two building types. And what we decided to do was, instead of doing the test with different naturally occurring and man-made events, we looked at, what if we took a high-performing building, tested it with 3 disruptions, disconnected it from the power grid for 10 days, disconnected it from water supply and wastewater removal, and vehicle transport as the third piece, all for 10 days, tested those buildings, then redesigned them as regenerative systems, tested them again, and saw how they performed to come up with our research. We also did our modeling using future weather files from the IPCC 5th assessment, so that we also were thinking about, how do we incorporate future weather conditions into our buildings here in Minnesota as we go. We looked at, so we did this early research with 2 building types, multifamily residential building that came to be known as a shelter-in-place scenario for us, because it's a building that would be hit by one of these sort of disruptions, and the occupants in the building would try to stay in the building and, quote, shelter in place until those systems were restored in the future. The other building type that we looked at, that we started to think of as the resilience hub, would be a building like a public library or a community school or a community center, where it would be hit with the disruption, and there might be other buildings in the community that were damaged, destroyed. People needed to leave them, kind of board them up and leave them, and have a place to stay, a place to charge their phones, a safe place until people could get to them to support them and the systems were back up. This resilience hub idea, and I won't go too much into it, but it started to become kind of a good idea because these, for us, because these resilience hubs, if you will, these building types of community centers, schools, and libraries, if you think about it, if you take the Twin Cities, most of the population lives within 1 mile of one, if not multiple types of these buildings, that if we started to set them up to be these sort of resilience hubs, it would give us another source, another place that we could go, if if something happened to kind of disrupt our community. And the important thing to keep in mind with these sort of resilience hubs is that, where they might be designed with one occupancy for daily operations, maybe it's a library, you design it to have 50 people in it. Well, now all of a sudden in a event scenario, the occupancy would go up for that building. So instead of 50 people, it might be collecting 500 people from the neighborhood, who are sheltering there, and sleeping there, charging phones, et cetera, being fed there, until the event is through. So we tested these two different building types. Again, we used them with future weather files. And when you start to look at future weather files, a couple of things start to emerge. That one, strategies that we wouldn't have put a priority on when we've looked at weather history now start to become more important as we see our weather heating up, becoming more humid. And so strategies like sun shading of windows that wouldn't really have been a cost-effective strategy in the past might start to become cost-effective in the future. And cooling and dehumidification starts to increase, almost double in terms of the amount of hours where that is needed to provide comfort in the building. And so that becomes a more important strategy. In addition, we see that the energy usage, if you look at a code building or the old code or the new code building, the overall energy usage doesn't change because as heating goes down, cooling loads go up. So that isn't significantly different. What's really interesting is the importance of, in our optimized buildings, what we looked at is that design teams are creating high performance envelopes with high R value walls, high performing window systems, before they're going on to do renewable energy or other things like that. And what we see in buildings like this, and this kind of reinforces the importance of investing in really good envelopes, is that very good envelope that we originally created for energy efficiency reasons also creates it as a very good envelope that resists and isolates the internal environment from a lot of these weather changes we see in the future, especially when we're talking very high temperatures, very high humidity that we see in the future weather files occurring here in Minnesota. And if you create these high performing envelopes, it has the side benefit of energy efficiency for sustainability, but that gives you an envelope that can hold its temperature for long periods of time without the use of the mechanical system, for example. So you can keep occupants cool during hot times and take minimal amounts of energy to maintain safe ventilation and maintain temperatures over a 10-day disruption. And the same is true in both building types. And we looked at their kind of energy usage. So this was the example of the multifamily building, where the residential building has one level of the bigger circle is a larger amount of energy usage that occurs in sort of typical operations. The idea behind the shelter in place buildings is that when it goes into shelter in place mode, you reduce and only go down to kind of critically needed energy usage, so that you can use a minimal amount of energy over a long period of time to give people refrigeration for medicines, to have safe temperatures, not maybe ASHRAE comfort range temperatures, but safe temperatures so people can, live over time. And so it's interesting because a building, five-story multi-family building, which, in the kind of typical sustainable goal setting, you would say to yourself, well, it's impossible to have a building like this be a quote net zero building and generate all the energy it needs in the standard operations. But in the building, when it's in shelter in place mode, there's more than enough roof area to put solar panels on the roof, couple it with batteries, and continually provide enough energy to charge up the batteries so that you use energy. And you could go on for more than a 10-day disruption of the grid in shelter in place mode if you needed. And the library, is going kind of in the opposite direction because it's a resilience hub, low amount of energy usage. In its regular operation, it's increasing its occupancy by almost tenfold. So larger amounts of energy usage during the resilience hub mode. And, now we have a building that if we designed it to be net zero energy, just thinking of, an entire year, we wouldn't put as much solar panels on the roof as we would when we now kind of think of the scenario that maybe it would be a resilience hub, it would have more energy usage, and so therefore we might put more solar panels on to take care of this larger amount of energy usage if there was some kind of disruption. So it's a good example of, why you need to kind of have multiple lenses to think about, what is your building, what's your program, and how will you design into its systems, multiple ways to address these kind of shocks and things that could occur. And the other thing that we found in the research is the importance of shifting from goals, regenerative goals. This idea of shifting. One of the goals in this early research is that we were going to have the buildings mimic living systems, and so that would have those types of goals are things like you have multiple sources of supply of energy, you have a circular kind of closed loop energy system, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to think of how do you add resilience goals to that. And resilience goals would be adding to that list things like, well, we want to close energy system, but the reason we want that is so that we can have continuity of power, with whatever might happen. We redesign the water system so that we can have a continuity of water and sanitation systems over time. And so it's important to kind of do this sort of multiple lens goal setting of what's our sustainability goal, what's our resilience goal, and then translate those into macro level strategies of, things like having a higher performing envelope, et cetera, will help us maintain habitable temperatures. Operating the building in low power mode, storing energy. I think, this idea of low power mode, hub mode, et cetera, start to think of the buildings you're designing as how could they have different modes that you're designing for? And then you're integrating micro strategies, things like battery storage, solar panels, the equipment HVAC equipment you're selecting, the way you're designing the building envelope are then being designed considering these multiple lenses so that you can achieve your macro strategies and get back to achieving your regenerative goals, resilient goals, and sustainability goals in the buildings you're designing. And as we start to integrate this work into B3, one of the challenges that we have is that our mandate in the legislation that created the B3 guidelines are primarily for sustainability. So in our early phase, what we have to look for is, where is there an intersection of resilience with sustainability, so that those are the things that we can then integrate into the B3 guidelines to create requirements and capabilities that design teams can put into their projects to kind of add value to their clients, providing sustainability and resilience, and create a better built environment here in Minnesota. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Liz, who will give you more specifics about how we're integrating this research into the B3 guidelines.
Thanks, Richard. As mentioned, I'll be covering our B3 approach to resilience, which has been in development for the past year or so, and will be introduced for projects beginning pre-design next year. The biggest change will be a new guideline in the performance management section. The intent of the new guideline is to bring awareness and intention to the functionality and role of the project in the event of a disruption of energy, water, communication, or other services. The guideline will require an assessment using our newly developed tool, the B3 Resilience tool, and implementation of at least one design strategy as a response to that assessment. The B3 Resilience tool is an Excel-based worksheet. It includes some preloaded data from the Minnesota State Hazard Mitigation Plan, which was updated and released in 2019. This plan is developed by the Department of Public Safety's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Division and is approved by FEMA. It includes a county-level survey of the history and possible future of natural hazards across the state. Because the Minnesota Hazard Mitigation Plan is the backbone of the worksheet, the assessment begins with a county-level natural hazard assessment, proceeds to an assessment of human-made hazards, and then an assessment of the capacity and goals of the project, and finally, a process of identifying resilient design strategies that respond to the hazards and the goals identified. So let's get into the tool here. The first tab of the tool is a directions tab, which includes an overview of the worksheet and a description of what project teams will complete and submit for each phase of the B3 documentation. So that's the first tab that you can see on the lower left there. This tab, the active one, is the vulnerability assessment, and that's the first tab with user inputs and tool outputs. So here's the natural hazard assessment portion of this first tab. This is the part that's linked to the county level data from the Minnesota Hazard Mitigation Plan mentioned before. All of the blue fields shown here are ones that will be auto-populated when the user selects the project county from the drop-down menu, which we'll see here. So here are the results for Ramsey County, and our project address is entered above there. At the very top, Ramsey County's own hazard mitigation plan status is listed, and if the plan is available, which in this case it is linked there. Project teams are encouraged to consult plans when they are available. All counties are required to create a hazard mitigation plan, and about half of them are available online as of this version of this tool. You can see also that the other blue boxes have been filled and some have turned red. One included data set from the Minnesota Hazard Mitigation Plan is a county vulnerability ranking for each hazard. So each county has a rank between 1 and 87 for those hazards, with 1 being the most vulnerable and indicated in red. So in this case, we know right away that Ramsey County is among the most vulnerable in Minnesota to high wind, tornadoes, and hailstorms. The dark yellow and light yellow boxes are places where the project team will select from a drop-down or to key in information. Some of the indicator fields require information from an external source, which is linked in the tool here. And here are some of those resources. On the top left is Ramsey County's multi-hazard mitigation plan, mentioned before. The middle top is the USDA and USFA wildfire potential map. Next to that is a FEMA tornado risk zone map, which combines wind zone and tornado frequency to develop tornado risk. Bottom left is the FEMA flood map. And on the bottom right is a tool from the Applied Technology Council called the All Hazards tool, Applied Technology Council is a group of civil and structural engineers, and this tool is referenced for high wind and tornado events as well. These external sites require an address to find the information, but that's it. And the metric or the indicator is identified clearly in the spreadsheet to make sure that the information is accurate and clear that is being recorded. So after compiling the information about the listed natural hazards, project teams are asked to discuss and to determine the risk level to their specific project site and program, and which building systems may be impacted by a significant natural hazard event. Impacted services in the tool include electricity, natural gas, potable water, wastewater or sewage, transportation to or from the project, the physical structure, the safety of occupants, communication, or food access to and from the project. So in this example project, there's a medium wind risk for the site, and because this area is served by overhead power lines, electricity is a vulnerable system due to wind risk. And because this is a fairly dense site, there's also a danger of hazards flying through the air associated with wind or tornado risk. So this process is the distillation of the county level data down to the project site level and even the system level. So this is meant to be a discussion and based process of translating high level data down to building level impacts. Continuing on that same vein, we're looking here at the human-made hazards included in the tool. It's also vitally important to consider these, but there is a lack of data or underpinning to base probability on. So in this case, we're asking for design teams again to discuss potential indicators and risk levels for the following types of human-made hazards, which might include an epidemic or pandemic, civil unrest, a cyber attack, infrastructure failure, fire, explosion, a major accident, or sudden and severe air or water pollution. After indicators are discussed, risk is assessed in the same way as with the natural hazards. Here are some examples of indicators for some of the human-made hazards. For an epidemic or pandemic, something like occupant density might be a useful indicator, knowing what we do now about social distancing. For something like a fire or explosion, the presence of large quantities of flammable or combustible materials on site may be an indicator. And again, the perceived risk for each hazard is identified, as well as the systems most likely to be impacted. The last part of the vulnerability assessment tab is a summarization of the services likeliest to be impacted, step 4, and the highest priority hazards, step 5. Again, these are based on discussion and should be guided by this assessment. In this case, the most common services to be potentially disrupted were the building structure and related the safety of the occupants and the provision of potable water. The hazards of greatest concern were winter storms and extreme wind. The next step and the next tab is the project assessment tab. In this tab, we look at the building's capacity to respond to the previously discussed hazards and potential service disruptions. The first part of the assessment is establishing the building's primary use, its engineering risk category, and the expected service life of the building. The ASCE building risk category, linked in the spreadsheet and shown here, is an engineering classification of building types. The official definition is a categorization of buildings and other structures for determination of flood, wind, snow, ice, and earthquake loads based on the risk associated with unacceptable performance. In practice, these risk categories are used by structural designers in determining the design pressures for structures and building components. The general theory is that a category 1 building would fail before a category 2, a 2 before a 3, and a 3 before a 4. For this purpose, and for the B3 resilience purposes, this classification is intended to draw attention to the risk category of the building in conjunction with the previously assessed natural hazards and risks. The served population of the building is also considered here. Studies show that those in vulnerable groups, including the elderly and the young, are especially impacted by hazard events. So this is an opportunity to identify those user groups in the project. Similarly, the user is asked to find the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index value. The CDC defines social vulnerability as the potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on human health, including natural or human-made hazards or disease outbreaks. The Social Vulnerability Index value is determined by 15 census data points in 4 categories, which are socioeconomic status, household composition, race, ethnicity, and language, and housing and transportation. This total social index value and the specific values that make it up may be useful in the resilient goal setting and goal realization for this project. The resilient goal setting is the next step in the project assessment. And for the purposes of this tool, there are 3 resilient goals to choose from. Here they are listed. Richard has referenced these types of buildings or goals. So to recap, there's the shelter in place model, which secures the current occupants safely for the duration of a system outage or until they can safely evacuate. Most literature and modeling that we reviewed in this study indicated that disaster relief services take an average of 4 days to reach victims. So that's the threshold we're using for these goals. The next goal is the resilience hub, which secures both the current occupants and opens to others who do not have access to shelter, again, for that 4-day duration of a system outage. And then the final type of project goal is to evacuate and shut down. In this situation, the building would need to be evacuated safely and then able to secure against physical damage. So here are the inputs for our sample project. We see that it will be a multifamily building, which puts it in risk category 2, and the expected service life is 100 years. I'll note here that the long life of B3 projects make resilient design measures all the more important and meaningful to protect public investment in the project. So at this pre-design stage, we don't know a lot about the anticipated population mix, but we have an idea of the total residents and have found the social vulnerability index value, in this case, moderate to high. This project has established the resilience goal of shelter in place for the people who live there. So for a multifamily building to operate in a shelter in place model, the services required for that would be space, cooling, and heating of occupied areas, restroom use, which includes potable water and wastewater, refrigeration for food and for medical storage, device charging, and accessibility, including elevator operation. So the next step is to begin to identify how those services are provided in the building, both in day-to-day operation and in the event of a system failure. Additionally, project teams are asked to assess their critical electrical loads based on their resilient goal and use NREL's REOPT Light tool to assess what a resilient solar generation and battery storage system would look like. Here's an example of the NREL tool output for this project. This assumes that the critical load of the building will be 50% of its typical operating energy. And at this early design stage, this REOPT tool is using a DOE reference building to calculate the base load and the critical load percentage, and therefore the associated PV and battery storage requirements. So this result is rough, but is able to be done at an early phase. And this analysis can and should be more refined as detailed information about the building's energy system is developed and is available. This step also does not require any concrete action or implementation beyond analysis. It's intended to provide information to project teams and to project owners for their consideration for inclusion in the project. Here we see the other inputs for our sample project. And again, we're in the early design stage, so these are generic type inputs. We can see, for example, that for potable water, we'll plan to use the municipal water system, but don't have a known backup. We know that the heating system will be electric based with a natural gas backup and so on. And below that, we can see the outputs from the RELi tool with that preliminary information about what a resilient power system would look like for this project. The last step and the last working tab of this tool is the strategy bank. This is a collection of resilient and sustainable design strategies pulled from various guides and standards. Each strategy is linked to appropriate hazards protected against and services served. Any relevant B3 guidelines are also noted, as well as the source of each strategy for further information. At the top of the screen, we can see a summary of the previous tabs, including our highest priority hazards, the services most likely to be impacted, the resilience goal, and the services required to accomplish that goal. To narrow the design strategies listed in this tab to those most applicable for the project, the user can select the relevant hazards on the left side of the sheet here, and then the services supported by those strategies here in the middle. So the resulting strategies listed below are those that address the top priority hazards, in this case, winter storm and extreme wind, and support the services most likely to be impacted, in this case, structure and safety. From the resulting list of strategies, the user is asked to identify at least one strategy for implementation in the project. In this case, because the perceived risk of winter storm and extreme wind were similar, we are selecting one strategy to address each. Ice dam resistant construction for the roof, which will support thermal conditioning and moisture protection of the envelope, and a fortified certified roof, which is a voluntary program administered by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety and includes design details and material requirements. This strategy bank is not exhaustive. We expect to add to it and update this tool regularly. In the case that there are no appropriate strategies identified, or if the design team has something else in mind, there will be an opportunity to manually enter resilience and sustainable design strategies and describe the source and impact of that strategy. I'll also take this chance to ask for any additional resources I may have missed that should be incorporated in this tool. Our contact information will be available at the end of this presentation, and we are open to feedback, additional resources, or anything else. This tool is still in development ahead of the January launch date for these guidelines. I mentioned that the design strategies in the tool were pulled from various sources. These are those sources. So we have the Urban Sustainability Directors Network Guide to Developing Resilience Hubs, the RELi guidelines and lead pilot credits from the USGBC, the Enterprise Green Communities Strategies for Multifamily Building Resilience, Green Building and Climate Resilience, a publication from the University of Michigan, and the previously mentioned fortified standards. All of these guides and documents are linked in the worksheet tool for additional reference. In addition to our new guideline requiring the use of this assessment tool, we will be adding a few other measures to the guidelines. In the energy and atmosphere section, project teams will be required to assess their building energy use with a future weather file. These future-looking weather files attempt to capture the effects of climate change at a localized level. And similar to the renewable energy assessment, project teams will not be required to act on this data beyond the consideration and discussion of it. Their possible implications include over or undersized mechanical systems and the physical space required for that equipment, or consideration in changes of the efficacy of passive strategies, as Richard mentioned earlier. The recommended guidelines include demonstrating passive survivability with no electricity, which entails maintaining safe interior temperatures for a period of 4 days during representative peak time, which again is related to the super insulated envelope requirements mentioned earlier. There may also be some material considerations for durability to hazards, including fire or wind impacts, using materials that can be repaired or replaced with local labor and stock, and considering expanded insect ranges, especially termites. Because sustainable design and resilient design are closely linked, several of the guidelines already in the B3 program contribute to the overall resilience of buildings and sites. In the site and water guidelines, there are requirements around floodplain restrictions, stormwater management, soil stabilization, and resilient vegetation that all contribute to resilience. Of course, renewable energy efficiency, and efficient plug loads contribute to lower energy requirements for buildings at all times, and in critical load situations to lower the required generation and storage needed for resilient power systems. Additionally, guidelines to ensure moisture-safe construction and thermal comfort enhance the durability of the envelope and further contribute to passive survivability. Use of low power lighting and daylighting further reduces critical loads during emergency operation. And comprehensive wayfinding can ensure that people can move easily in the project and that anyone sheltering in the building can navigate and access it, which can contribute to community resilience and support sheltering and resilience hub goals. Finally, the materials and waste guidelines require use of durable materials, consideration of design for deconstruction in the event of a building damaged beyond use but with salvageable materials, and a reduction of hazardous materials in the project which may affect humans during extended occupancy or which may become hazardous when burned. And finally, this is a very quick overview of our peer program's approach to resilience and how our B3 process can fit within those programs to contribute to these optional points. We've already referenced the LEED pilot credits, which are for assessment and planning for resilience and one for design for enhanced resilience, both of which would contribute to the optional innovation credit in the LEED system. Enterprise Green Communities awards optional points for a vulnerability assessment, for strengthening cultural resilience, for providing potable water during emergencies, and for resilient energy systems in the form of floodproofing and providing electricity for those critical loads. And now I'll hand off to Becky to describe best practices for incorporating resilience planning into your practice.
Thanks, Liz. I'll be jumping in here to talk about how to translate some of the tools and ideas that Richard and Liz have talked about into practice, and what to keep in mind specifically as architects. So what's the architect's role in designing for resilience? Well, we should be understanding the hazards, vulnerabilities, and risks for the project site, analyzing the risks that the building will face, not just today, but over its service life, and discussing these with the client, and then assist them in setting resilience goals. We can also recommend strategies that align with both the resilience goals and other project priorities, whether it's design goals, the project budget. Some of these strategies will likely show up on our construction documents, such as building envelope strategies, and will also help coordinate others that show up in the scope of project engineers, for example. We'll likely also help coordinate the transition to building operations for the strategies that are dependent upon both design and operations. And finally, some strategies will be primarily in the owner's court, like stocking emergency supplies. So I'll be walking through some best practices and things to keep in mind during each of the steps shown here on this slide. So what should you keep in mind when conducting a vulnerability assessment? First, ideally, this would be done prior to site selection and programming to help inform these activities. Avoiding floodplains is one obvious example of this, as shown here, and is something that is required by B3 elsewhere in the guidelines. You may be able to find documentation that's already been created that compiles information for your project site, whether it's a hazard mitigation, climate adaptation, or resilience plan. So as Liz demonstrated, the B3 tool links to county-level hazard mitigation plans. For a little bit finer resolution of detail, this extreme heat risk map is from St. Paul's Climate Action and Resilience Plan, which also includes other risks and resilience strategies. But also remember that site-specific conditions may alter the risks identified in larger scale community plans. Next, if available plans don't already do it for you, be sure to layer information from different sources to understand the whole story. So an example shown here from Roseville's population vulnerability assessment shows areas within the city with the highest percentage of people who are 65 and older. And it calls out that these adults are more sensitive to risks such as extreme temperatures, flooding, and air quality. Elsewhere in the report, which I've overlaid here, it maps flooding risks. And these happen to occur in those same areas where many older adults are living. And in fact, there's another map in this same report that shows the poor air quality associated with 35W, another area where many of these older adults are living. Be sure to note the age and the source of the data that you're referencing. In some cases, the relationship between older data and what's happening today is relatively obvious. For example, in cities that don't have, or in neighborhoods, say, that don't have a lot of turnover, large percentages of children under 5 years ago will turn into large percentages of children 5 to 10 years old 5 years later. But in other instances, trends over time are a little bit less predictable. So this example is showing days with maximum temperatures above 95 degrees, both historically and projected into the future. And we know that extreme heat and precipitation events have increased and are anticipated to continue increasing. So many areas that may not currently require air conditioning or flood protection are more likely to need these strategies during the lifetime of the building. And just a note on this graph here, the red scenario is assuming a business as usual increase in greenhouse gas emissions, while the blue scenario is assuming that global emissions stabilize. And in the description of the graph, it notes that people who have a low tolerance for risk often focus on the red scenario. So that's something you're thinking about when you're setting your resilience goals for the project. What is the risk tolerance of the owner and of the building users? Once you have a handle on the different hazards, like extreme heat, you'll need to evaluate the relative risks of these hazards leading to harm. So as Liz showed with the B3 tool, the county level plan identifies hazards and the likelihood of each hazard occurring. And then the project team would evaluate the potential impacts of the hazard to the building and to its users before determining the relative risk. And one simplified way of doing this is to weigh the likelihood of the hazard versus the impact of that hazard occurring on the building occupants and the building itself. So bringing back in Richard's example of the recent civil unrest, this is something that may have had a low impact on some buildings, graffiti, or maybe a change in operating hours, a bigger impact on those that had broken windows or looting, and then a larger still impact on those that ended up burned to the ground. So depending on their location and the social climate now and in the future, of course, this type of event likely falls into the category of a rare catastrophe, where the best recourse would be to insure against it rather than designing around it. Extreme heat, on the other hand, is more likely to be presenting itself regularly in years to come, and should therefore be considered as part of the design and management of the building, whether that's sizing the cooling system to accommodate future weather or providing personal thermal comfort options for days when the central system can't keep up. And then in red there, the probable disasters definitely need to be considered during the design. An example of that might be flash flooding in a low area. So as you come to better understand the project-specific risks, you'll also be setting resilience goals. And a few key points to keep in mind here. First, resilience is a design challenge, and architects are great at solving problems. So we can add value to both built strategies and operation strategies by using our design thinking skills. Next, important to involve an integrated design team. And since many resilience strategies are dependent on operations and management policies, be sure to include the building owner, operator, and future occupants if possible. I was working on a project a few years ago where I learned that the organization has a resilience leader and team, but they weren't in the room when new buildings were being designed. And those that were in the room weren't thinking about much beyond backup power systems, for example. So making an effort to connect those dots can help ensure that the resilience goals for the project are in line with what the organization is already working towards. In addition to the operators and engineers and other team members you expect, you might also include people like insurance brokers in some of these conversations who can advise on the financial implications of different resilience strategies. And finally, goals will vary by program and hazard type. So as one example, a transit or public works authority likely has a goal of maintaining bus or snowplow operations during extreme weather to serve the many people in their community who rely on them for mobility. So the resilience goal of a bus or public works vehicle maintenance facility would likely be to maintain operations throughout extreme weather. An office building, on the other hand, may prefer to offer temporary shelter while outside conditions are dangerous, but then evacuate and shut down during the recovery period. That same building that can afford to shut down for a short-term disaster may need a different plan to address a longer-term crisis, such as a pandemic, for example. At LHB, we frame resilience based on the extent to which the building and site maintain functionality, and we're thinking about both critical functionality, life-supporting services, as well as productive functionality. So that's the difference between keeping people alive and keeping people at full productivity at their jobs in the event of short-term shocks. We're also interested in how the building and site respond to social, economic, and environmental changes that are happening over time, whether it's able to adapt to those that might be predicted and everybody sees coming, or are so agile that it can dynamically adapt to anything that comes along. We're also looking at how each project either supports or burdens its surrounding community during periods of disruption or stress. And it may not make sense for every single project to serve as a resilience hub, but it's important to at least have the conversation about what does make sense. AIA Minnesota's 21st Century Development Matrix provides more specifics on what a resilient development looks like, including starting with a risk assessment and emergency plan. In standard practice, that wouldn't be done, it would be added in under good practice. Better adds in backup generators in case of emergency and access to nearby amenities and facilities. A living community would achieve resilience through infrastructure, community resources, and social interactions, providing a place, a resilience hub for residents to congregate in case of an emergency, backup power still, disaster response plan in place, and infrastructure located out of the floodplain. And in the regenerative scenario, not only is everything in place, but the community is ready and understands their role in response to an emergency, and even provide a resource for other communities. So a little bit more detail on what a resilience hub entails, and this is something that both Richard and Liz have introduced earlier in the presentation. So a resilience hub helps to coordinate resource distribution and services before, during, and after a hazard event. And at a minimum, it would provide critical services such as shelter, electricity, water, food, ice, refrigeration, charging stations, and basic medical supplies. It may also provide space for longer-term support, such as space for growing food, trees for shade, and resources for residents who are sheltering in place rather than evacuating, including education for residents and businesses on what they can do to respond before, during, and after hazardous events. Resilience hubs can be especially successful in buildings where service to the community is an integral part of their program, as Richard was suggesting with the library and recreation center examples. The Urban Sustainability Directors Network describes the ideal resilience hub as an enhanced community center with established community ownership and trust. These centers would be able to contribute to building social resilience year-round by offering additional services such as translation, flu shots, diabetes screening, job training, or after-school programs. But that type of thing may not be appropriate for every single project that you're working on. We wanted to discuss the synergies and conflicts between resilience and sustainability. So Liz already walked through how measures throughout the B3 guidelines contribute to both sustainability and resilience, whether through site selection, connections to trails and transit, stormwater management, biodiverse plantings, water and energy efficiency, passive thermal and lighting strategies, and renewable energy, which is one that requires the additional ability to operate independently from the grid to move from a sustainability strategy to a resilience strategy. I also wanted to point out the importance of wayfinding and universal access, both for protecting occupants during extreme conditions that may impact visibility or mental cognition, but also for projects that are intending to open up to the broader community as a resilience hub, where users may be much more diverse than those who use the building on a daily basis. There are, of course, also some potential conflicts between sustainability and resilience, mostly focused on the theme of using additional resources to oversize spaces or systems in order to be ready to handle the extreme scenarios. So in Richard's example of oversizing the library's PV system to accommodate resilience hub loads, this is relatively easily addressed by sending the excess clean power back to the grid. In other cases, you might decide that it doesn't make sense to design a cooling system to be able to handle a rare 110-degree day, and that other strategies like personal thermal comfort systems may make more sense to tackle these extreme conditions. And in other cases, you may just be trying to choose a more sustainable resilient solution, such as ensuring that an oversized structure uses low carbon materials or offsetting the extra electricity from air conditioning with on-site solar. We wanted to leave you with a few key takeaways before opening it up for questions. So first, embrace resilience as a value add to your client. Some are already requiring resilience to be considered, and many others are newly realizing its value. So celebrate this as another service that we can provide, and engage staff who are especially interested in this topic to become experts at it. Next, if no one else is, raise the topic. So whether you're an emerging professional asking your project manager or a project architect bringing it up in a client meeting. With sustainability, we are surprised by how often when we ask why sustainability wasn't mentioned in an RFP or in the project goals, we hear, oh, well, we just assumed that you'd be designing us a sustainable building. So just like sustainability, most resilience goals and strategies need to be understood by the whole team in order to be successful. So whether you get an answer like that and say, great, let's move forward discussing it, or it's something where you're providing some additional education to the client. 3, can't stress enough, consider the future. This is what resilience is all about, whether this means using future weather files to inform design strategies or looking at how the building's program may shift in years to come. And we've also continued to emphasize that envelope performance, which is one of the pieces that architects have quite a bit of control over, is critical for passive survivability. So don't sell yourself short on that. And finally, don't be intimidated by the new vocabulary or the abundance of resilience information that's available. This is just another design problem to solve. And rather than going out and reading every resource on resilient design you can find, try to stay focused on understanding the resilience goal for the project, identifying and addressing the top hazards, and then figure out how you can synergize the resilience strategies with the other strategies you're employing, whether they're sustainability strategies, design strategies, cost effectiveness strategies, community engagement strategies, whatever they are. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and hand it over to Dan to open it up for questions.